Welcome to Trend Reddit, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world together through the videos I create. Don't forget to hit the follow button to stay updated with the latest information. Thank you for visiting, and I hope we'll have great experiences together. In a dramatic, intense situation, a police officer publicly humiliated a black governor. But what no one expected was that the events that followed would change everything. Will justice be served? Let's uncover the surprising twists in this story, where power, honor, and courage clash fiercely. Join Trend Reddit as we dive deeper into the story. Governor Malcolm Davis had spent his entire career fighting for justice. His speeches and policies focused on combating systemic racism, especially within law enforcement. However, Malcolm was growing tired of data and reports that didn't capture the lived reality of many African Americans and Latinos. He knew the only way to truly understand what his people endured was to experience it himself. It was this determination that led to a bold plan, one that put everything on the line, including his reputation. Disguising himself as an average citizen, Malcolm would drive through the same neighborhoods where racial profiling and police aggression were rampant. His security team, aware of the risks, would monitor him from a distance, ready to intervene if necessary. But Malcolm insisted they only step in if his life was in immediate danger. Dressed in faded jeans, a worn-out hoodie, and driving a beat-up old car, Malcolm became invisible, blending into the city streets. The decision to conduct this experiment had been heavy on his mind for months, but today, there was no turning back. The neighborhood he drove into was notorious for its high police presence. Officers frequently patrolled, and stories of unjust stops were all too common. As Malcolm navigated the streets, he couldn't help but feel the eyes of authority on him. His heart raced, but his face remained calm. He had lived through tense moments before, as a leader, but this felt different. This was personal. Within minutes, he saw the flashing lights behind him. Malcolm took a deep breath. The moment had arrived. Officer Craig Phillips, a seasoned cop with years on the force, approached Malcolm's car. His face was expressionless, but there was a tension in his body language that Malcolm immediately recognized. It was a stance of authority, of suspicion. Craig didn't even need a reason to stop him. His intuition had told him all he needed to know. Malcolm, in his current disguise, didn't belong in this neighborhood. License and registration, Officer Phillips said curtly, his eyes scanning Malcolm with distrust. Malcolm complied, handing over the documents, all while maintaining a calm demeanor. Inside, though, the reality of what was unfolding was sinking in. He had been the target of such implicit bias many times before, but not like this, not as an ordinary man with no status to protect him. Officer Phillips seemed increasingly suspicious, his questions growing more intrusive. "What are you doing here? Where are you headed?" Malcolm answered calmly, his tone measured. "Just driving through, officer." "Is there a problem?" The officer's eyes narrowed, and his hand moved subtly towards his holster. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his voice laced with tension. Malcolm hesitated for a brief moment, but he knew the stakes. This was the moment he had prepared for. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out, standing before the officer, aware of the small crowd beginning to gather nearby. People with cell phones were already recording, sensing the tension building. As Malcolm stood there, face to face with Officer Phillips, he could feel the situation escalating. The officer's hand never left his holster, and his questions became more aggressive. "Why are you in this neighborhood?" Officer Phillips asked again, this time more forcefully. Malcolm maintained his calm, asserting his rights, but he could feel the officer's frustration growing with every passing second. The crowd murmured among themselves, their presence both a comfort and a danger. Malcolm knew that, at any moment, things could spiral out of control. Yet he remained composed. This was the reality so many lived through daily, the same reality he sought to change. But it wasn't just an experiment anymore. Now, it was real. As Malcolm stood there, the tension in the air was palpable. Officer Craig Phillips, still eyeing him suspiciously, circled the car, his presence commanding control of the scene. Malcolm, dressed in his worn-out hoodie and jeans, knew this was the crucial moment. Any wrong move or misunderstood gesture could turn this into something far more dangerous. Philip's voice was cold and authoritative. "Hands where I can see them." Without hesitation, Malcolm raised his hands slightly, keeping them visible. His expression remained calm, but internally, he was measuring every word, every action. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone who had ever been in his shoes, faced with the same hostile gaze. "Why are you in this neighborhood?" Phillips asked again, this time his voice sharper, more demanding. Malcolm maintained his steady tone, choosing his words carefully. "I was just passing through, officer. Didn't realize there was an issue." Phillips, still suspicious, glanced toward the gathering crowd. The presence of bystanders seemed to aggravate him, making him even more cautious. His hand moved closer to the weapon at his side, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of dominance. "Step away from the car," Phillips commanded, not breaking eye contact. Malcolm did as he was told, taking a few steps away from the vehicle. He was acutely aware of the eyes on him, those of the officer and the curious crowd. People in the neighborhood had seen this scene play out too many times, and some had already started recording the interaction on their phones. Philip's frustration seemed to mount. He wasn't getting the reaction he expected. Malcolm wasn't defensive, wasn't combative, but the officer's implicit bias continued to drive his escalating behavior. His face hardened, and he took another step closer to Malcolm, his voice lowering but carrying a sharper edge. "You don't seem like you belong around here. What exactly are you doing?" Malcolm, knowing full well that revealing his true identity would end this encounter in an instant, resisted the urge. That wasn't the point. He was here to experience the reality of what others faced. "So," he answered calmly, "just driving through, officer. Nothing more." Phillips wasn't satisfied. He glanced back at the car, suspicion clouding his judgment further. "Mind if I take a look inside?" Malcolm knew his rights and was fully aware that there was no probable cause for a search, but he also knew that any form of resistance, even respectful, could push this officer over the edge. He stood his ground, though, his voice firm yet calm. "I'd prefer not, officer. There's no reason for a search." The crowd murmured again. Some of them edged closer, still filming, sensing the imbalance of power in the interaction. Phillips noticed, and it clearly unnerved him. His hand rested on his holster again, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Malcolm, still maintaining his composure, saw that things were dangerously close to escalating further. He kept his voice steady. "Officer, I've done nothing wrong. I'm just passing through. Let's not make this more than it needs to be." Philip's face showed a flicker of uncertainty, a momentary crack in his hardened demeanor. The officer had expected something else, a different reaction, perhaps defiance, anger, or fear. But Malcolm wasn't giving him that. The crowd, the phones, the scrutiny, it all weighed heavily now. For a brief moment, Phillips hesitated, but then his professional mask slipped back into place. He wasn't ready to let go. His eyes bore into Malcolm's, the unspoken question of whether he should push further hanging in the air. The murmurs from the crowd grew louder, some of them whispering to each other, some even saying Malcolm's name. The tension was undeniable now, a thick, electric charge ready to ignite with the slightest provocation. But Malcolm held firm, his resolve unshaken. He wasn't backing down, but he wasn't giving Officer Phillips the confrontation the man seemed to want. His calm defiance wasn't just for himself, it was for everyone who had ever been in his position, caught in the crosshairs of suspicion for nothing more than existing. Phillips exhaled sharply, visibly frustrated but constrained by the weight of the crowd's eyes on him. The tension between Malcolm and Officer Phillips was thick, the kind that weighed heavily on the air, each moment adding another layer of uncertainty. Officer Phillips, growing more frustrated with each passing second, took a small step forward. The subtle shift in his stance sent a clear message, he wasn't backing down. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Phillips said, his voice low but sharp. "What are you really doing here?" Malcolm, still standing his ground, kept his hands visible and his expression calm. His goal wasn't to provoke, but neither was it to back down. He knew the stakes. He understood that his every word, every movement was being watched, not just by Officer Phillips, but by the growing crowd behind them, some with their phones held high, recording everything. "I told you, officer," Malcolm said, his voice measured. "I'm just passing through." But Phillips wasn't satisfied. His hand, still hovering near his holster, showed that he was growing impatient. His eyes flickered to the car, then back to Malcolm, as if searching for some hidden piece of evidence to justify his growing suspicions. "Step away from the car," Phillips commanded again, but this time his tone left little room for argument. Malcolm complied, moving a few paces further, away from the vehicle and closer to the edge of the crowd. The onlookers, still whispering among themselves, could sense the shift in the officer's demeanor. Something in the way Phillips moved suggested that this encounter was far from over. Phillips scanned the crowd with a quick, nervous glance. Their presence was clearly agitating him. But instead of diffusing the situation, he seemed determined to regain control. His hand rested on his weapon, a gesture that sent a ripple of unease through the onlookers. "You got something to hide?" Phillips pressed, his tone more accusatory now. "Because right now, you're looking real suspicious." Malcolm knew better than to react emotionally, but the implication stung. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being treated like a criminal simply for existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. But his purpose remained clear, to experience what countless others had to endure. And now, with the crowd recording, it wasn't just about his own safety, it was about exposing the systemic bias playing out before them. "I have nothing to hide," Malcolm responded, his voice unwavering. "But I also know my rights." Philip's eyes narrowed. His frustration was clear. The calm defiance Malcolm maintained only seemed to fuel the officer's determination to assert control. "Don't play games with me," Phillips snapped. "You're not in charge here." "I am." The crowd stirred, the murmurs growing louder. A few voices, barely audible, expressed their concern. The tension was growing by the second, and everyone watching knew it. Phones were still recording, capturing every second, every word exchanged. Malcolm could sense the situation teetering on the edge. The officer's posture was rigid, his hands still dangerously close to his weapon. Yet Malcolm remained calm, refusing to give Phillips the reaction he was likely expecting. "You're making this harder than it has to be," Phillips said, his voice now tinged with frustration. "Step back and let me do my job." Malcolm stood firm, his voice calm but resolute. "I've complied with everything you've asked, officer. But I won't let you search my car without reason." Phillips took a deep breath, visibly irritated by Malcolm's composure. The tension in the air was now suffocating, and the crowd, sensing that things could spiral out of control at any moment, grew more restless. Some stepped closer, others whispered to one another, their concern palpable. But Malcolm wasn't afraid. He was ready. He knew that no matter what happened next, the truth of this encounter would be undeniable. He had faced pressure before, in political debates and protests, but this was different. This was real. And he wasn't just standing up for himself, he was standing up for everyone who had ever been in his shoes. Phillips, now visibly agitated, glanced toward the growing crowd once more. His grip tightened on his belt, his authority slipping with every passing second. And yet, Malcolm held firm, a calm but powerful force against the escalating storm. The tension between Officer Phillips and Malcolm had reached its peak. With the crowd growing larger and their phones still recording, Phillips' frustration was evident. He was no longer just dealing with Malcolm, he was performing under the watchful eyes of a dozen witnesses. His grip on the situation was slipping, and he knew it. "Hand over your ID again," Phillips demanded, his voice harsher now. His gaze fixed on Malcolm, as if searching for something, anything, that would validate the escalating confrontation. Malcolm hesitated for a brief moment. He had anticipated this point would come, but now, standing in the middle of this moment, he understood the gravity of the next few seconds. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and handed over his identification, all while maintaining his calm demeanor. Phillips snatched the ID and glanced down at it, still harboring a glimmer of suspicion. If you find it interesting, please like it. If not, please comment number 1. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. Then, recognition dawned on Phillips' face. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he scanned the name, Malcolm Davis. His expression faltered, and the hard edge that had characterized the encounter so far began to soften. He blinked, reading the name again, his mind working through the realization of who he had just pulled over. Governor Malcolm Davis, the same man who had been advocating against police misconduct, racial profiling, and the very behaviors Phillips had displayed just moments ago. The crowd, still murmuring, started to pick up on the shift in the air. Someone from the gathering quietly whispered, "That's the governor," and the words spread like wildfire. The murmurs became louder, and the tension that had been so thick a moment ago began to dissipate, replaced with a growing realization. Officer Phillips' face was a mix of shock and disbelief. His posture stiffened as he glanced up at Malcolm, the full weight of his actions crashing down on him. His authority, once unshakable, was now crumbling under the recognition of his mistake. The crowd sensed it too, their cameras still pointed at the scene, recording every second of this turning point. Malcolm stood tall, watching as the power in the situation shifted. He knew this was the moment where the truth would come to light. With calm authority, he spoke, his voice clear but firm, ensuring that both Phillips and the crowd could hear him. "I am Governor Malcolm Davis." The words echoed in the stillness of the moment. The crowd went silent, the murmurs vanishing as everyone processed the gravity of what had just been revealed. The weight of Malcolm's identity hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. He wasn't just any man standing in front of Phillips, he was the very leader who had spent years fighting against the kind of treatment he had just endured. Phillips' confidence shattered in an instant. His once commanding presence had been reduced to shock and confusion. The officer's hand dropped away from his weapon, his stance no longer aggressive but uncertain. The gravity of his actions was clear in his eyes, and he realized that every move he had made up to this point had been a mistake. The crowd, once passive onlookers, had transformed into silent witnesses. They had watched the entire encounter unfold, and now they understood the magnitude of what they were seeing. The governor, subjected to the very same racial profiling he had vowed to end, had remained calm, patient, and composed throughout the ordeal. And now, the truth was out for all to see. Phillips fumbled for words, but nothing came out. The silence between him and Malcolm was louder than any of the murmurs from the crowd. The officer was trapped in the reality of his actions, his earlier confidence replaced by the crushing weight of his misjudgment. Malcolm, still composed, took control of the situation. His voice, calm yet commanding, broke the silence again. "This is what we are fighting to change," he said, his gaze never leaving Phillips. "This is why reform is necessary." The crowd, now fully aware of the significance of the moment, remained silent. Their phones continued to capture every detail, every word, every expression. Officer Phillips stood there, unable to respond, his role in the unfolding drama shifting from aggressor to symbol of a broken system. Malcolm's calm authority had taken control of the situation, and with his words, the balance of power had shifted irrevocably. This wasn't just an encounter between a police officer and a citizen anymore, it was a public reckoning. The video of the encounter between Governor Malcolm Davis and Officer Phillips spread rapidly across social media. Within hours, news outlets had picked up the story, and the footage, recorded by numerous bystanders, went viral. The governor, a symbol of justice and reform, being subjected to racial profiling, sparked immediate outrage. It wasn't just another incident of police misconduct, this time, it involved a figure known for fighting the very injustice he had just experienced firsthand. Protests erupted in the streets. Demonstrators, fueled by the video, gathered outside the governor's office, outside police precincts, and in public squares across the city. Chants demanding accountability and justice filled the air, and signs condemning racial profiling and police violence were everywhere. What had started as another ordinary day had now ignited a citywide movement. "Governor Davis is one of us," shouted one protester, their voice amplified by a megaphone. "If this can happen to him, what does that say about the rest of us?" The sentiment was shared by many, as the video served as undeniable proof of the systemic racism Malcolm had been trying to address for years. The footage was replayed on television, dissected by commentators, and debated on talk shows. News anchors discussed the implications of the encounter, and experts were brought in to analyze the police's behavior and Malcolm's composure. Overnight, Officer Phillips became a national figure, though not in the way he had ever imagined. The police department quickly found itself in damage control mode. The public relations disaster was unfolding faster than they could manage. Press conferences were called, and statements were issued, but none seemed to stem the tide of public anger. The footage was too damning, the evidence too clear. Officer Phillips was immediately placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. His superiors were divided in their response, some defending his actions, while others, more aware of the political and social implications, distanced themselves from him. The department scrambled to contain the fallout, but the damage was done. The very system they represented was now under a microscope, and the public was demanding answers. Governor Davis, for his part, remained calm in the face of the uproar. He addressed the state in a televised broadcast, acknowledging the incident but focusing his attention on the larger issue at hand. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice steady but impassioned. "This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. It's about the millions of people who experience this every day, without the protection of a camera, without the platform to tell their stories." His words resonated with many. Protests grew, but so did calls for reform. Malcolm's experience had given a face to the injustices he had been fighting against for years, and the public, now more engaged than ever, demanded change. Within the police department, tensions were running high. Some officers felt betrayed by how quickly their colleague had been condemned in the public eye. Others, more sympathetic to the calls for reform, recognized that this incident was a turning point. The department had long been accused of harboring systemic bias, but now, with the governor himself as a victim, there was no denying the need for introspection and accountability. Officer Phillips, in the midst of the storm, faced an uncertain future. The internal investigation began compiling evidence, his body cam footage, the bystanders' videos, and witness testimonies. Each piece of evidence painted a clearer picture of his actions that day, and as the public outrage continued to grow, so did the pressure on the department to take decisive action. In the streets, protests turned into organized demonstrations, and calls for reform became louder. Activists, community leaders, and everyday citizens demanded stricter oversight of the police, more transparency in their actions, and, most importantly, an end to racial profiling. The incident had ignited a flame that could no longer be ignored. Governor Davis, steadfast in his resolve, knew this was the moment he had been waiting for. The public was ready for change, and now, with the entire country watching, the time for reform had arrived. Following the viral incident and the intense public outcry, Governor Malcolm Davis knew it was time to act decisively. He stood at the podium, addressing a state already inflamed with anger and frustration, but also with a clear desire for change. His tone was firm yet hopeful as he laid out his vision for reform within law enforcement. "This is not about attacking our police force," Malcolm began, his gaze steady. "This is about rebuilding trust between officers and the communities they serve. It is about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their race or background, is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." The governor's speech wasn't just another promise of future change, it was a call to action. He announced the immediate formation of an independent commission to investigate racial profiling, excessive use of force, and systemic inequalities within the police force. This commission would not be influenced by politics or internal police loyalties, but would instead consist of a diverse panel of community leaders, legal experts, and civil rights advocates. "We need to look at the hard truths," Malcolm continued. "This commission will have full authority to review cases, examine patterns of behavior, and provide real, actionable recommendations for reform. One of the most significant aspects of his plan was the introduction of mandatory anti-bias training for all law enforcement officers. This wasn't just another round of lectures, it was a comprehensive program designed to challenge and change the implicit biases that had become so deeply ingrained in the police culture. Officers would be trained to recognize these biases and learn how to avoid letting them influence their decisions on the job. In addition to training, Malcolm also called for stricter oversight of traffic stops and police interactions, particularly in neighborhoods that had been historically over-policed. Every stop would be logged, reviewed, and analyzed to ensure there was no pattern of racial profiling or unjust targeting of specific communities. Body cam footage would be reviewed regularly by independent monitors, ensuring transparency in the actions of officers. Furthermore, Malcolm emphasized the importance of community-based policing initiatives. He envisioned a police force that didn't just patrol neighborhoods but actively engaged with them. Officers would attend community meetings, work alongside residents in local projects, and build relationships with the people they served. This initiative was aimed at humanizing both the officers and the community members, fostering a sense of trust and mutual respect. Police should not be viewed as outsiders, Malcolm said. They must be seen as part of the community, as protectors who know the people they are sworn to serve. But perhaps the most groundbreaking part of Malcolm's reforms was the creation of an independent civilian oversight board. This board would have the power to hold the police accountable, review complaints against officers, and recommend disciplinary action when necessary. No longer would the police department be solely responsible for policing itself. This external body would ensure that justice was served fairly and transparently. This is about accountability, Malcolm declared. No one is above the law, not even those who are tasked with enforcing it. As the governor laid out his plans, the crowd listened intently, many nodding in agreement. For too long, communities had felt powerless in the face of police misconduct. Now, they were being given a voice, and a real mechanism for holding officers accountable. Malcolm knew that these reforms wouldn't be easy to implement. There would be resistance, especially from within the police force. Some officers would see the changes as an attack on their profession, while others might feel that they were being unfairly judged. But Malcolm was firm in his belief that these reforms were necessary for progress. "We are not here to tear down our police," he reiterated. "We are here to build them up, to make them better, more just, and more trusted by the people they serve." The governor's speech marked the beginning of a new era in law enforcement within the state. The road ahead would be long, and the changes wouldn't happen overnight, but for the first time in years, there was a sense of hope. Malcolm had taken the first step toward bridging the divide between the police and the people, and the reforms he proposed were the foundation for a more just and equitable future. The city, once simmering with anger, now looked toward the possibility of real change, led by a governor who had not just spoken about injustice but had experienced it firsthand. In the wake of the public outcry and the governor's reforms, Officer Craig Phillips found himself at the center of an internal investigation that would define his career. The initial shock of pulling over Malcolm Davis, the governor, had begun to wear off, replaced by a heavy realization of the consequences that followed. His actions were now under a microscope, and the evidence against him was mounting with every passing day. As the investigation unfolded, Phillips faced the reality of what he had done. The body cam footage, alongside recordings from numerous bystanders, painted a stark picture of his behavior during the encounter. He had approached Malcolm with a level of suspicion that was unwarranted, driven by implicit biases that he had either ignored or not recognized in himself. The glaring disparity between the way he treated Malcolm and how he would have interacted with a white citizen became painfully clear. The Internal Affairs Unit brought Phillips in for questioning, a meeting that felt more like an interrogation. He sat in the cold, sterile room, facing a panel of officers who looked at him with a mix of disappointment and disbelief. They played the footage from that day, showing the moment he had pulled over the governor, the escalating confrontation, and his increasingly hostile demeanor. Watching himself on screen was a jarring experience. He had never intended for things to spiral so out of control, yet there he was, confronted by the harsh reality of his actions. The weight of his implicit biases and prejudices bore down on him, a heavy burden he could no longer escape. "Why did you approach him the way you did?" one of the investigators asked, his voice steady but probing. "What was your reasoning for treating him as a suspect?" Phillips fumbled for words, struggling to articulate the rationale behind his behavior. Deep down, he knew it was rooted in assumptions that had been ingrained in him over years on the force. The uncomfortable truth was that he had allowed his biases to cloud his judgment. He felt ashamed, but there was little solace in that realization. As the investigation progressed, he began to receive messages from fellow officers. Some expressed support, while others distanced themselves, echoing the division that had formed within the department. The public had turned on him, and the weight of being a symbol of systemic racism felt suffocating. Each day, Phillips grappled with the gravity of his actions. He had once viewed himself as a protector, someone who upheld the law and served his community. But now, he saw how his actions had undermined that very mission. The realization that he had contributed to the system he had sworn to serve became a painful awakening. He spent sleepless nights reflecting on that day, the governor's calm, the crowd's mounting concern, and the way he had acted out of instinct rather than reason. Malcolm's composure had been a stark contrast to his own, and it haunted Phillips. As the days turned into weeks, the internal investigation concluded, and the findings were delivered. Phillips faced disciplinary action, a decision that carried both consequences and an opportunity for reflection. He was placed on suspension and required to undergo extensive training in anti-bias and community engagement. Phillips knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey. He had to confront his own biases and work to change not just his behavior but also the mindset that had allowed such prejudices to fester. The suspension felt like a necessary consequence, but it was also a chance at redemption. He realized that change wouldn't happen overnight, but it had to start with him. During his training sessions, he listened intently as facilitators shared stories from community members who had faced similar experiences. He began to understand the fear and distrust that many felt toward law enforcement, feelings that he had previously dismissed. Each story resonated, compelling him to look inward and confront the reality of his past actions. Slowly, Phillips began to see that he had a role to play in the reform process. He could become part of the solution rather than remain a symbol of the problem. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was determined to learn, grow, and work toward rebuilding the trust he had helped shatter. As he prepared to return to duty, Phillips understood that the road to redemption would be long and challenging. He was ready to face the consequences of his actions, not just to seek forgiveness but to actively participate in changing the culture within his department. The reckoning had begun, and with it, the possibility for genuine change. In the aftermath of the incident, Governor Malcolm Davis faced a whirlwind of emotions. The public outcry had reached a fever pitch, and his reforms were already being scrutinized. But amid the chaos, he knew there was a critical decision to make regarding Officer Craig Phillips, the officer who had become a symbol of the very issues he was fighting against. As the days turned into weeks, the media buzzed with debate. Some hailed the governor's response as a bold step toward justice and reform, while others criticized him for his compassion toward an officer who had perpetuated racial profiling. The pressure weighed heavily on Malcolm, but he remained committed to his vision of reconciliation and progress. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings, Malcolm received a call from his office. It was Officer Phillips, requesting a private meeting. The governor's initial instinct was to hesitate. What could the officer possibly say that would justify his actions? However, he understood that true leadership required listening, even to those who had erred. When Phillips arrived at the governor's office, the tension in the air was palpable. The atmosphere felt heavy with unspoken words and regrets. Malcolm gestured for Phillips to take a seat, and for a moment, neither spoke. The silence was filled with the weight of their respective experiences since that fateful day. Finally, Phillips broke the ice. "Governor, I want to start by apologizing," he said, his voice steady but filled with remorse. "I know my actions that day were inexcusable, and I've had time to reflect on everything. I understand now how deeply I contributed to the systemic issues we're trying to address." Malcolm nodded, appreciating the acknowledgement. It takes courage to own up to mistakes, especially in a public role. "But I want to know what you think should happen next." Phillips hesitated, weighing his words carefully. "I want to be part of the solution. I realize I have a lot to learn, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to rebuild trust with the community." Malcolm listened, intrigued by Phillips' sincerity. "You know, many would argue you should face harsher consequences for your actions. There's a lot of anger directed at you." "I understand that," Phillips replied. "But I believe real change requires participation from within the system. If I can be a part of the reform process, maybe I can help bridge the gap between the police and the community." The governor considered this. Phillips' desire for redemption was genuine, but was it enough? He knew that change couldn't happen in isolation, it required cooperation from all parties involved. Perhaps this was the opportunity he had been searching for, an unexpected avenue toward healing. "Let me propose something," Malcolm said, leaning forward. "I want you to join the independent commission that will oversee the reforms. Your insights as an officer will be invaluable, and your presence could serve as a symbol of change within the department." Phillips looked taken aback. "You want me to help with the very reforms I was a part of undermining?" "Yes," Malcolm affirmed. "But it will require humility and hard work on your part. You will need to actively engage with community leaders, listen to their concerns, and help implement the necessary changes. This is your chance to show that you can be part of a solution." A flicker of hope crossed Phillips' face. He understood the gravity of this opportunity. "I won't let you down, Governor. I want to make this right." Malcolm extended his hand. "I believe in second chances. It's how we grow and learn from our mistakes. But remember, this isn't just about you, it's about everyone affected by the system. If we can work together, we can begin to rebuild trust." As they shook hands, Phillips felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in a long time. This was his chance to change the narrative, to be part of something greater than himself. Malcolm had offered him a lifeline, and he was determined to grab hold of it. News of the governor's decision would undoubtedly spark mixed reactions, but Malcolm was resolute. His commitment to reform extended beyond punitive measures. By offering Phillips a chance to contribute to the solution, he was sending a clear message: true change comes from understanding, compassion, and collaboration. As Phillips left the governor's office, he felt a renewed sense of responsibility. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to face it head-on. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful about the possibility of redemption, not just for himself, but for the entire police force and the community they served. As the dust began to settle from the highly publicized incident involving Governor Malcolm Davis and Officer Craig Phillips, the state entered a new chapter in its journey toward reform and healing. The governor's commitment to addressing systemic issues in law enforcement had resonated with many, igniting a renewed sense of hope among citizens eager for change. The independent commission that had been established began its work almost immediately. Comprising community leaders, legal experts, and even members of the police force, the commission set out to investigate cases of racial profiling and excessive use of force. The dialogue was often tense, as raw emotions surfaced, but it was also marked by a genuine desire for understanding and improvement. Phillips, now an active participant in the reform process, attended meetings alongside community members who had previously viewed him with distrust. With every session, he listened to stories of pain and frustration, absorbing the weight of the experiences shared by those who felt victimized by the very system he had once defended. It was a humbling experience, forcing him to confront not just the mistakes of that day, but the broader implications of his role as a police officer. As weeks turned into months, the impact of the reforms began to take shape. Officers underwent mandatory anti-bias training, learning about the nuances of implicit bias and how it affected their interactions with the community. The training sessions were not just lectures, they involved candid discussions and role-playing scenarios that allowed officers to experience, even if just for a moment, the challenges faced by the residents they served. community-based policing initiatives flourished, fostering stronger relationships between officers and residents. Neighborhood meetings were held regularly, with officers attending not as enforcers, but as allies committed to making their communities safer. Trust, once shattered, was slowly being rebuilt, brick by brick. The establishment of an independent civilian oversight board marked another significant step toward accountability. Community members were now empowered to voice their concerns regarding police behavior, ensuring that officers were held accountable for their actions. Complaints were taken seriously, investigated thoroughly, and resolutions were reached collaboratively. This newfound transparency shifted the perception of the police force, transforming it from an entity that operated in secrecy to one that was increasingly accountable to the public. Governor Davis remained at the forefront of these reforms, frequently addressing the public to update them on the progress being made. His commitment to justice was unwavering, and he recognized that change was an ongoing process. "We are not just reforming a system," he stated in one of his addresses, "we are reshaping the very fabric of our community. This is about creating a society where every individual is treated with respect, regardless of their background." The political landscape began to shift as well. Other leaders across the country looked to Malcolm's approach as a model for their own reform efforts. The public conversation surrounding police accountability and racial justice had evolved, with more individuals recognizing the need for change at both local and national levels. As for Officer Phillips, he found himself on a path of personal growth. The experience had changed him fundamentally. No longer did he view his role in black and white terms, he began to understand the complexities of the communities he served. Through his involvement in the reform process, he aimed to become a catalyst for positive change within the police force. The journey was far from over, and challenges remained. Not everyone supported the changes, and resistance from within the department lingered. Yet, the commitment to reform had taken root, and the momentum was undeniable. Each step forward was a testament to the resilience of those who had fought for justice and the power of understanding and collaboration. In this evolving landscape, Malcolm Davis and Craig Phillips were reminders of the potential for redemption and growth. Their experiences had intertwined in a way that highlighted the necessity of empathy, understanding, and a shared commitment to a better future. Together, they symbolized the ongoing struggle for justice, a journey marked by both challenges and triumphs, one that continued to shape the narrative of their community for generations to come. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.